Hello, lovely people. This is Professor Matt, and this is the Too Many Guys Soccer Show. And this is part two of the three-part series that I'm doing on the intersection between fascism and football. Uh, I was hoping on recording this probably about a week or two earlier, but between midterm exam grading hell and the fact, and you probably hear it in my voice, I'm still coming off a head cold. So this got pushed back a little bit, but we're still on track. And right, my hope is this will be out definitely by the end of, October, the beginning of November. And I should, we'll see, because then final exam grading hell happens, the life of a working academic. But my hope is to at least prep the final episode, which is going to be on Franco Spain, uh, sometime over the next couple weeks, and that will be out early December, definitely before Christmas, right? And in that video, I'll let you guys know about what I'm going to be doing, a different series on the other side of the new year. So I got some exciting, I think I got some exciting stuff planned for you guys. Anyway, this is going to be shorter than the first video, right? Because we're not going to be defining our terms. We've done all that stuff, right? And so this video is going to be centered around, football in Nazi Germany. And two things right off the bat. The first thing, probably no regime in the history or in modern history has been written about more than Nazi Germany. For better or for worse, everybody wants to read about the Nazis, you know? Well, it's like the History Channel before it became the Speculation Network, right? That H stood for Hitler. It was all Hitler all the time. Uh, but it's weird. Even though over the last 10, 20 years, the field of history through sport has grown in leaps and bounds. And, the field of, historical literature, particularly vis-a-vis football, has expanded and grown in new and unusual ways. There's a weird dearth of academic literature on football, soccer in the Third Reich. There just is. No one's writing about it, certainly not in Germany, and not in the English language either. So, I mean, I was able to cobble together some stuff, right? But unlike, it's weird. Like, there's been two major monographs written about football and fascism in Italy, from, Italian and one non-Italian historian. There's been a lot of good work written about, football and Francoism in Spain. Uh, right, there's a lot of stuff coming out about football in the socialist bloc, but there's, for whatever reason, not that much academic literature on football in the Third Reich, which is weird. It is weird. Right. And the other thing, which I guess is the overarching thesis of this video, which I mean, fuck Nazis, right? Uh, Unlike Italy, and definitely unlike Spain, the years of Nazi rule in Germany, uh, it was shorter, obviously, than Spain, and even in Italy too. Right. Fa Fascism in Germany left practically no legacy in terms of, uh, the game itself. In fact, again, this the sort of overarching argument. The 12 years of, fascism in Germany set German football back probably at least a generation, right? It is an epic failure and a failure on so many different levels. So, like we said in the last video when we talked about, football in fascist Italy, fascism and football in some ways goes together like bacon and eggs, right? Or at the very least, fascism in sport, because sport has this propagandist, function. And right, the Nazis, just like their counterparts in Italy, they're ideological ethos was to create a new German, right? And sport was another way to just do that. And right, so sport was a vehicle, right, to get ordinary Germans behind the regime, to mobilize them again. Fascists love stadiums, they love full stadiums, they love emotion, all that good stuff. And right, sport was also seen as a way to create racial excellence or racial purity. Right, because, at the core of fascism is this, Darwinian, racism, which emerges, which pre-existed fascism, like we talked about in the last video. But, sport is a vehicle for that. But with football, much like, Italy, and obviously we'll talk about Spain, football is touchy, right? And it's touchy for a couple reasons. It is a working class sport. Indeed, football comes to Germany in the second half of the 19th century as, the German lands, starting with Prussia and, sort of northern German states, but then eventually the entire country industrializes and industrializes rapidly. So it's a working class sport, which means there's a lot of, commies and socialists who play it and are into it. And that's a problem, right? Much like Italy and indeed Spain, it's in the German context, it was incredibly regional. And I'll talk about this too, because the Nazis, kind of like, the fascists in Italy, attempt to, modernize or reform German football, but they actually do it that we'll get there. Like I said, failure. But right, to root for a specific club in Germany usually meant a very specific regional identity being attached to that. Whether you were from the Ruhr or Bavaria or, Saxony or Brandenburg, etc. Right? And so football, far from being a great unifier, which that's what fascists want to do. They want to unify the national body and erase regional differences and class differences, etc. Uh, football feeds into regional identity, and in Germany in a very real way. And it's not even just regional; it's like the neighborhood, right? The Germans are like this in terms of beer as well. If you ever go to Germany and you go to a city, every neighborhood in every city has their own brewery. And it's very much like sort of punk rock, right? That local identity, is very real and, very hardwired. And, football's the same way, right? The other thing too is we look at Germany and the German national team now, and we're like, oh, look how diverse they are. But look, German football was always diverse, right? There's a large Jewish presence within German football from jump, and right, Germany had an immigrant population, right? They industrialized, and just like everybody else, they take in immigrants. And so a lot of the people playing football in Germany, in the 20s and in the 30s, uh, they're not quote unquote ethnically pure Germans, right? There's a huge Polish presence. Podolski and Klose weren't the first Polish guys playing football in Germany. There's Czechs, there's Slovaks, there's people from Central Europe that beginning in the 19th century and then through into the 20th century migrated into Germany to find jobs in the industrial sector, right? So much like Italy, football for the Nazis is important because it's a way to sort of, legitimize your regime, to show off, this new Germany, but also as a way to, in a very real way, craft this new German Superman. Right? But football, just by being football, kind of doesn't mesh well with fascism, right? It's working class, which again means there's socialists and communists, and Germany, certainly in the 20s and the 30s, had an extremely vibrant, large socialist and communist movement. Right? It promotes regionalism, so Bavarian identity over German identity, or Prussian identity over German identity. Uh, And right, it's filled with, people who the Nazis would refer to as Untermensch, right? Subhumans, Jews and Poles and Czechs and Slovaks and Hungarians, etc. And right, too, more so even than in Italy, because Mussolini fancied himself a sportsman. He was this barrel-chested kind of, I ski. Hitler, despite, subscribing to the theory of the master race, was very much, and this is why we have to not give dictators too much credit because they're really just punks. It's like how I always, say, Putin's just some guy from the projects in Leningrad who, when he was a kid, liked to torture rats. That's all he is. Hitler was a failed out art student who was the least athletic human being on the face of the planet. And right, he wasn't a sports fan. He understood the importance of sports from a sort of political level, but he could not care less about sports. He didn't root for a football team. He never played the game. And indeed, unlike, let's take, for example, the Soviet Union, where Lavrenti Beria was head of the secret police and, played football, right in his native Georgia. None of the Nazis, none of the Nazi leadership are interested in football, ever played football, etc. And a lot of that has to do with a lot of these guys are lower sort of middle class. They are, petit bourgeois. They're not working class. And football is a working class game, particularly in Germany at this time, right? The middle classes don't really do football. And indeed, the Nazi leadership, again, look at these guys. They're not athletes, even though they project this image of the pure Aryan. And whenever that image of the pure Aryan somehow gets like, ruffled up, they all collectively lose their minds. So in the 1936 Olympics, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, right? I know the iconic moments of that tournament is Jesse Owens, an African American athlete, taking a giant dump over, the Nazi master race theory and spoiling Hitler's Olympics. And indeed, right, Albert Speer, Hitler's, architect, and a war criminal, and a war criminal who got off easy, entirely too easy. Uh, in the aftermath of the 1936 Olympics, this quote I think just sums up a lot. This is Speer. This is Hitler, was highly annoyed by the series of triumphs by the marvelous colored American runner, Jesse Owens. Uh, People whose ancestors came from the jungle were primitive, Hitler said with a shrug. Their physique were stronger than those of our civilized whites, and hence they should be excluded from future sports games. So, for a regime that propped up this, racial superiority and stuff like that, almost at every turn, sport, which should be the venue to like prove your racial superiority, prove your national greatness, bites them in the ass because they get abused, right? And we'll talk about the German national team and we'll talk about the 34 World Cup, where they actually do pretty well. 36 in the Olympics, where they crap the bed. And then 1938, which, ooh, that's so sport rather than serving as a propaganda piece, even though God knows they try, usually backfires. And a lot of it is kind of by design, too. So, like I was saying, before the Nazis came to power, the German league system was kind of a mess. It was a dinosaur, really. It was called the, excuse me here, Bezirksliga. And so rather than like in England, where already you had a national football pyramid, fascist Italy, because right, the Mussolini does get the memo that you got to get rid of this crazy regional thing. You have to like create a national league. And the Soviet Union, where they were starting from scratch and they were like, of course we're going to do it like the Brits. Uh, right, The German league system, again, going back to regional identities, is this hyper regional mess where each German state, because, right, Germany unifies in the 19th century, but it unifies as a series of separate principalities and entities. Every principality had their own championship. And then, like in the late spring, all of the regional champions would play each other in playoffs. It was a mind-bogglingly crazy, chaotic system, and certainly one which wouldn't, cater to national unity, which again is what fascism strives for. So as soon as the Nazis come to power, uh, football is enlisted in, right, the Nazi ideological project. And indeed, the German Football Federation ceases being an independent entity and comes under the larger umbrella of something called the Reich Sports Ministry, under the leadership of a guy by the name of Hans von Schranzer und Osten. It's kind of a crazy ass name. And he was Reichsführer of Sport. So the Reich leader of sport. So he was the sports czar of Nazi Germany. And all sport fell under this big umbrella, including football. And, one of the first things that the Nazis do when they take power is that they say they're going to reform or modernize German football, the structure of German football. But the thing is, they don't do what Mussolini does in Italy. They don't copy the British, which is weird because Hitler loved the British, right? White dudes with an empire, right? And they certainly don't do what the Soviets do. They reform the league into something called the Gauliga, right? Because what the Nazis do in an attempt to unify Germany and create a unified German identity as opposed to a hyper-regional, Bavarian, Saxon, what have you identity, uh, is that they reconfigure Germany not in the form of these historical states that have all been independent, uh, but rather in six regional GAUs, right? Administrative units. And so you get this thing called the Gauliga. And, right, the Gauliga, rather than being a national league, actually is just a weirdly updated version of the old clunky regional league, right? Uh, and this is passed in May of 1933. And this is the first time that football is fully professionalized in Germany. But again, there's some issues here. Or there's some general weirdness here. Because rather than doing what the British or what the Italians are doing, you just get a new version of the old model. Now there are 16 individual gal leagues, which have their own competitions. And then those 16 champions go and they play in a knockout, best of 16 championship. So the Nazis attempt to reform the German football pyramid, the domestic pyramid, to promote national unity. But the way they do it is kind of equally arbitrary, and it's still, compared to what they're doing in Britain and in Italy, like, this weird dinosaur backward thing. And, right, it might be one of the reasons, again, more about this in a little bit, why the German national team, even though it was legitimately talented during this period, why the German national team consistently underperforms, right? And indeed, German national team manager Otto Nerz and his successor, Sepp Herderberg, both, when the discussions about reforming the German league came up, they were in favor of something they called a Reichsliga, which would have been like a Nazi version of the Premier League, right? Where it's a national unified league, and you have a legitimate pyramid, and maybe in the lower levels it got really regional, but it was a truly unified highest competition. And the Nazis said, no, no, we don't want that. We're gonna reorganize Germany around these GAUs, and so we're just gonna have this Gauliga. Right. So the first thing the Nazis do is they reorganize German sport. Uh, and then almost immediately after that, they start purging German soccer, German football, which again, maybe this is why the national team sucks so much. Of all the things that are, you know, non-Aryan, non-Nazi. So who are who are the targets here? Well, the first clubs that get bid are working clubs, workers' clubs. Why? Very obviously, they were attached to either the Social Democratic Party or the German Communist Party, both of which, within the first couple months of the Nazi seizure of power, are made illegal. So any club associated with either the Communist Party or the Socialist Party or labor unions, they're just shut down. They no longer exist. Indeed, they're declared anti-German, right? And so this hits a lot of clubs, particularly in working class areas like Saxony, so like around Dresden and stuff, and in southwestern Germany in the Ruhr, so like Dortmund and stuff. These clubs get hit preposterously hard because these worker established clubs get shut out immediately. And then it's Jewish sports associations. And in 1933, when the Nazis come to power, they don't ban them outright at first, but they're forced to play in a segregated non-Aryan tournament. So you got this goofy Gal League going on anyway, but then you have this segregated, this is the Jewish tournament, right, which runs from 1933 to 1938. Before that is also outlawed, and explicitly Jewish clubs tied to Jewish organizations are outright banned. And a lot of clubs that had some kind of Jewish connection, Bayern Munich being the most obvious, but also Austria, then, the big Austrian club in Vienna at the time, after the Nazis, after the Anschluss in 1938, when they take over Austria. These clubs, they don't go under, they're not banned, but they are punished, and they are punished hard because they represent, non-German, non-Aryan sport, right? And, this is a real issue, especially for Bayern, right? Bayern's coach at the time, Ricard Domby, is Jewish, and he's a rather successful coach. Bayern wasn't Bayern yet, but they were getting there. And, he is unceremoniously, a year after the Nazis come to power, he's forced out. And, Bayern Munich, devolves into, not particularly a really good team. And also to clubs with a clearly sort of foreign makeup. And we'll talk about how clubs could get around this in a second, but like clubs, particularly in industrial areas, again, a lot of these clubs happen to also be workers' clubs too, where you had a large Polish or Czech contingent. These clubs were either banned or, forced to Germanize. And indeed, right in 1938, after the Germans, rip off the Sudetenland and eventually all of the Czech lands, uh, and then after obviously 1939 when they invade Poland and incorporate Polish territories and more ethnic Poles into the Greater Reich, these pre-existing Polish and Czech clubs that had existed before they were incorporated into the Greater Germany. Uh, Again, first they're segregated, right? So, like, there is a weird Polish championship in 1940 where Polish teams just play Polish teams. But after that, they're also banned, right? And so, and in some places where you had mixed populations, existing German, ethnic German clubs, right? Or, new Germified clubs are, formed. So the Nazis come in, they reorganize German football around their own image. They create this goofy Gal Liga, which really is sort of an upgraded version of the previous, German league setup. It's still hyper regional. It's just using these new artificial administrative zones as opposed to historical states. Right. And, they weed out all that they see as foreign or non-German or contamination. And this is a disaster for German football. Uh, you can't underplay this, right? Because take for example the Ruhr, which is where Dortmund, Schalke, there's a whole bunch of German clubs are in this one weird pocket of Germany. Right. If you look at the Bundesliga table and you look at the geography of the Bundesliga, there's a bunch of clubs right there. And why? Because this was Germany's coal region. So there's a lot of coal miners and workers and right, this was the most industrialized part of Germany. So it was like Germany's, Pittsburgh and Detroit rolled into one. Well, when you start decapitating working men's clubs and you start, banning Jews, but also immigrants, and there's a lot of immigrants. There's a lot of ethnic Poles, a lot of ethnic Czechs in the Ruhr out of the game. Well, you're going to see a drop off. And indeed, there is a massive drop off. And it's a direct result of these Nazi policies. So rather than, strengthening German football as a means to show off to the world your racial superiority, your national superiority, superiority of your, ideological project, uh, the number of active players playing football in Germany by the second half of the 30s goes, why? Because the people that love football are being pushed out or being segregated out the game. And indeed, right, the quality of German football in the 30s, when the Nazis take over, yeah, it's goofy, it's semi-professionalized, there's this weird regional tournament, but like, places like Leipzig, the Ruhr, etc., these were centers of football, and the German game was improving and improving steadily from the time, the first clubs were introduced in the 1890s. By the time you get to the outbreak of the Second World War, 1939, the quality of German football is trash. It is horrendous. And right, the team that probably does the best under the Nazis domestically and it's weird because their fan base historically, particularly now, is actually kind of left of center. It's our old friend Schalke, right? And well, why does Schalke? And they win six titles during the 12 years of the Third Reich. So they're the dynasty of the Nazi years. Well, how the hell are they able to do it? Well, a core of players who, had at Schalke were also the sort of backbone of the German national team that the Nazis inherited. And right, these players are an interesting lot because I'll start naming some names. Uh, Tubilski, Kowalski, Fritz Schiepan, and Ernst Karoza. Four Shakhtar, wow. Schalke players, four German national team players, all with Polish last names. But here's the thing. So if you were a communist or a socialist, if you were Jewish, if you're Polish or Czech, okay. But if your family had been in the Reich for a generation or so, and these are German born, but ethnically Polish, We can maybe make certain exceptions, and there's an excellent movie about this, and it's almost Halloween, so maybe you guys should watch it. It's a Czech film from the late '60s, right after the Prague Spring, called The Cremator, which takes place in Prague during the Nazi occupation. Czechs who, had served in the Austrian army, were willing to go along with the Nazis, etc. They could be they could be salvaged, quote unquote. And indeed, these four really talented footballers, even though you're Polish, yeah, you can be salvaged too. Indeed, Fritz Schepan, who was the captain of both Schalke and the German national team, he took it a step further. He was actually a fervent Nazi. And when the Nazis took over and reorganized German sport, was apparently the guy who pushed for, the removal and the expulsion of the Jewish and or socialist, contingent at Schalke. He named names. Right. And so he becomes kind of this weird poster boy for Nazi football. And he benefits from it because not only does, he push out Jewish players, Jewish staff, etc., he also, because he's a Nazi Party member, because he's the captain of the best club team in the country, he's the captain of the national team. He also runs local businesses and he's a local, real estate guy. Yeah, he mysteriously gets a lot of property in rather disgusting ways. So not only, is this, second generation Polish German, transformed into this Aryan hero, which he wasn't. He was just a piece of shit. Right. He actually financially directly benefits from the expulsion of left wing and Jewish uh, voices in German football. But let's look at how the Nazi reforms and the remaking of German football in their own image, how this plays out internationally. Because, right, for the Nazis, international football, I think, in a way, was more. I mean, not look. Hey, we talked about Italy the last time. It was important, but for the Nazis, I think the German national team was way more of a showpiece because this is when the Reich would face their enemies on the field of battle. And right, if you want to prove your superiority, prove your racial purity, prove your ideological vision, and tell the people it's working. You got to beat your enemies on the pitch. When the Nazis come in, the German national team's actually pretty good. Right. They don't show up to the 1930 World Cup, partially because they don't have money because it's the middle of fucking depression. Right. And also, too, because the people who are running German football at the time are like, we're not quite ready yet. We're not ready yet. But give us 4 years and, we'll show up. And indeed, the German national team under the Nazis, right? Because once World War II starts, there obviously aren't any international tournaments. Uh, I might do something after the new year, though, about football in Nazi occupied space, particularly Ukraine. Again, more about that in the next episode. Uh, but the German national team plays in three major international tournaments during this period. Uh, the first is the World Cup in 1934, which is Mussolini's baby, right? Their showpiece tournament. Right. And like I said, this is a pretty decent German national team. Like there's talent there. Uh, and in a lot of ways, this is this this is their best result. And the reason it's the best result is because it's the least Nazi of these incarnations of the German national team. This is really more of a pre-Nazi team, which shows you what could have potentially been. Right. So the old World Cup, pre-war, there's no group stage. It's straight to the round of 16. And right, the Germans face Belgium in their opener and they thrash them 5-2. It's a convincing victory. Uh, they play Sweden in the quarterfinals. It's a bit of a tougher task. It's a good Swedish team, but they prevail 2-1. They play the Czechs, who ultimately make the final, only to lose to the Italians in the semis. And right, they get beat and they get soundly beat 3-1. However, they beat Austria, and more about Austria in a little bit, who arguably were the second best team in the tournament and had just lost to the Italians under very suspicious circumstances in the third place match 3-2 in what some people claim was maybe the best match of the tournament. So, you know, taking care of business against Belgium, beating a pretty good Swedish team. Hey, I mean, if you're a Nazi, losing to the Czechs suck, but no harm losing to a good Czech team. I think I mentioned that in the previous video. This is a pretty good little Czech team. Uh, and then beating the Austrians, the mighty Austrians, who granted were already, were mentally zapped, but still beating the Austrians, who were the arguably the best team, if not the second best team in Europe at the time, was a big deal. And expectations for the 36 Olympics, which the Nazis were holding, this was going to be their, baby, their showcase tournament for the world. Uh, the expectations were raised exponentially. And indeed, in 1936, in the first match, the Germans play Luxembourg and it ends 9-0. It is a bloodbath. It is a blitzkrieg. It's one of those score lines from older tournaments where it's like, wow, how did that happen? But then in the quarterfinals, they have to play the Norwegians, and Norway's got a pretty decent team. And by this time, by 1936, the problems created by the Nazis are starting to creep into the national team setup, right? You haven't really reformed the league system. You just reconfigured it, uh, right? And in some ways, your best players, you've decided to segregate or just throw the frick out. So with Hitler in attendance, the Germans go up 1-0 early and then proceed to squander that 1-0 lead and lose 2-1. Hitler, who didn't really give a crap about football, but again, football as a showpiece for the ideological project, he leaves early. He's like a Dodgers fan in the seventh inning, man. He just bounces because he can't take it. I mean, he's probably already had Jesse Owens PTSD, and now a bunch of Vikings are coming and, roasting your team in what they thought was going to be their tournament. And the Germans go out early. But there's another World Cup on the horizon, 1938 in France. And this time the Germans, the humiliation against Norway at the crib was one thing, but they're feeling really good about this tournament because Austria, who had been in the previous World Cup and who the Germans had beaten in the group stage, not the group stage, the third place match. And again, arguably the most talented team in Europe, maybe barring the Italians. Uh, right? They they're not in the equation. Why? Well, because the Germans have annexed them. So Austria, they're one of their biggest rivals, competitors, are taken out of the equation. There's civil war going on in Spain, so Spain don't show up. So the Germans are looking at the field and they're saying, okay, there's a Brazilian team, but this isn't Brazil. This is Brazil. Yeah, it's not Brazil yet. You have the host in France, but right, they're France, and we got Mussolini's boys. We got the Italians. We got a shot. Hungary has a pretty good team, but we have a shot, right? And it's not just that the Austrians are gone. It's that because Austria is now part of the Greater Reich, we can now import Austrian players. And indeed, the Reich's Ministry of Sport says we gotta recruit the best Austrian players and somehow insert them into this German squad. Now the Anschluss happens in March. So it's March and then the World Cup occurs in June. So you only have a couple months to do this. Six Austrian players who were politically reliable, aka not Jewish, not socialists, uh, are drafted into the German setup. And the Germans are sort of co-favorites with the Italians heading into the tournament because people are like, this German team 4 years ago was pretty good, even though they don't understand that the thing's rotting from within. And right now they've got six guys from the Austrian Wunder teams, and they're serious. But there's two problems here, two big problems. The first is the timeline. You take over Austria in March, and then you have to find a way to make six guys fit into your squad by June. That's nigh impossible. And indeed, it doesn't work because the Austrian players that do show up, more about, Austrian players who don't in a second, uh, they look lost. It's as if they've never played ball with these guys before. And indeed, uh, they haven't. And it really shows. It's a mess. The other thing, or the other aspect of this is, arguably the best player on those Austrian Wunder teams was a guy by the name of Matthias Schindler. And right, Schindler, he was the guy the Nazis really wanted to represent the German national team because, right, he he was the best player on that Austrian side and arguably the best player in Europe at the time. But he, in a rather, nondescript fashion, tells the Germans, no, I'm not going to play for you. And right, Schindler was in a lot of ways what the Nazis hated. He was left leaning. He may have been bisexual, and his girlfriend was a Czech sex worker. And he drank lots. So he was literally the epitome of decadence. But he was really good at football, and they really desperately wanted him to play, but he said no. And this was career suicide for him in a very literal way because he's immediately thrown off of his club team. Right. And the Gestapo opens up a file on him and he's constantly being watched. He can't play football in the Austrian league. He can't play football internationally because, well, he said so. Right. And, within a year, he actually commits suicide. There's still weird conspiracy theories that maybe the Gestapo killed him. I don't think that makes very much sense. Not that I have special information, but you know, he was already kind of neutered, and he was a guy who suffered from, he had demons, right? He suffered from, depression of some kind. So him and his, girlfriend took their own lives. That's a tragic story and it's one of many. Uh, but how does this play out for the World Cup coming up? Well, it means that you do have six Austrians in your team, but it's like the game that little kids play with the shapes. You got to put the sheep shape and the sheep shape and the triangle shape and the triangle shape. Well, these six Austrians are sheep shapes trying to get you know put into like squares, right? It's or cow shapes, right? It's the wrong shape. They're chickens. Uh, And the best Austrian player literally says, "No, I'm not going to play for your fascist ass." But there's still a lot of, excitement. There's still a lot of, optimism, especially because the Germans are playing, I guess you'd say, a minnow in the opening round in Switzerland. And right, so it's like, okay, we could beat Switzerland. The match ends 1-1. And right, this is before the group stage, so that means you have to, play a second match. Right, FA Cup style. The Germans lose the second leg 4-2, and they lose in pretty resounding fashion because even though they outplayed the Swiss, their talent, this is a talented team, showed up in the first match. The Swiss, having seen them, were like, okay, this team's flawed, and this is how we can beat you because you're not really a team; you're an assemblage of dudes, and the Nazi period in German football is just failure after failure after failure, and it's failure by their own creation. And indeed, right, even the propaganda aspects of the game doesn't hold through. The Nazis produced in 1942, so during the war, this goofy film, and you can watch it with English subtitles on YouTube. I actually watched it in prep for this. Uh, the title is Das Grafspiel, the big game. And right, it's this goofy propaganda film made during the war. So like there's not even like football going on. Uh that's this weird it's effectively a fantasy film. It's this film about, this pure heroic Aryan team uh who wins the league against all odds against these clubs that aren't, quote unquote German. It's a ridiculous film. Again, it's a fantasy film. Right. It's interesting because, pretty much half the German national team was, drafted into making the film. So there's actual professional German footballers in the movie. But the film itself is nonsense. It's a projection of what the Nazis hoped for football, but not the reality, which was the exact opposite. And look, I mean, the Nazis politicized football, uh, and they try to use it for propaganda purposes. But when you're getting beat by Switzerland. We're getting beat by Norway. Right. This backfires. And there's that famous image of, right, because beginning in 1934, uh, before every domestic match, and in every match being held in Germany, both teams needed to give the salute, right? The Nazi salute. There's that famous image of the English team that comes visit Germany in 1937, right? And they're the visitors, so they have to, do it. Half the English team says, "Nah, I'm not doing that." And so, right, there's this image of the German team all Zig Heiling. The English team, half of them are doing it, but the other half, probably good working class boys from East London or Manchester or Newcastle, just like, no, no, we're not going to do some fascist nonsense. And right, the same thing applied for the German league system and all of the occupied leagues in the German sort of empire during World War II. And so Schalke plays a friendly, right? Because in 1942 with the Norwegian club, right, FC Start. And FC Start doesn't even just not do the Nazi salute, they do this. They all do the Soviet salute, right? The clenched fist. And so, the organizers of this match are like, this is supposed to be like Aryan, Nordic Brotherhood, and all these Norwegians are giving the Soviet salute, like, you know. So far from even serving as a, vehicle for propaganda, everything the Nazis do turns to shit. It's an epic failure. And indeed, I'd argue that they set German football back. And once the war comes, there really is no German football. Uh, right, there is a league tournament during the domestic league continues during the war. Right. But starting in 1942, once the tide of the wars really turned and the German home front's really feeling the effects of the conflict, uh, right, the Gauliga itself is pretty much a non-entity, right? It's, single game knockout, and there's no real league. And so the Nazi footballing experiment dies with the Nazis. There is no legacy, right? I mentioned in the last video that, despite the fact that Mussolini and fascism goes away, kind of. In Italy, after the war, there is still a fascist legacy. For better or for worse, Mussolini created Serie A. Mussolini built the goddamn San Siro. Mussolini created Roma. And right, a lot of the ideological fault lines of Italian football are fault lines that are a byproduct of fascism because it's anti-fascist versus fascists. Right. It's Roma versus Lazio. It's Livorno versus Lazio. It's Napoli versus Lazio. It's the world versus Lazio. Uh, and other more right wing leaning teams. And then obviously when we talk about Spain, when we talk about a legacy, there is no legacy, which I guess is a good thing, right? Because first of all, Nazi punks fuck off, right? And National Socialism was not good for German football. Far from it. Everything it wanted to achieve, it failed, and it failed epically in doing so. Now, there is a far right problem in German football, particularly in what used to be East Germany, right? There is a skinhead problem. I've been to, the stadium in Dresden for Dynamo Dresden home matches. It's not fun. I didn't feel safe. Right. But these are not direct legacies of the Nazi period. These are legacies of the failures of German reunification in the 1990s, right? A bunch of young people that all of a sudden have no skill, whose skills are not, you know, uh, are worthless, right? Like it's that difficult transition from state socialism to neoliberal capitalism. And right, it's also kind of a byproduct of, migrate patterns of immigration and migration, etc. No one's denying this. Unfortunately, it's a thing, but it is not a direct byproduct of the Nazi period. Nazi football, at least in that form, dies with the Nazis. And indeed, it's one of the reasons I think German football, though, once it gets going, both in West and East, watch my previous video. Uh, by the 1960s, the West Germans and the East Germans can talk to people. I think it's one of the reasons why it takes German football a little bit of time to really get going after the war, because it's not just the damage of the war, it's also the damage done by the Nazis before the war. They set German football back. And, German football, Germany, and the world is certainly a better place without them. Anyway, uh, that's pretty much all I need to say or want to talk about today. As always, guys, like, comment, subscribe. My hope is this video is out first week in November, maybe even a little bit earlier. So we'll see what's up. And like I said, my hope is I'll definitely get the Spain episode out before the new year. My hope is sometime in early December. So like maybe the week or 2 weeks before Christmas, and I'll let you know in that video what I have up my proverbial sleeve uh for the new year because there's another series that I'm thinking about doing, and there's like maybe a one-off video with some guests which I've been thinking about for a while. But anyway, this is Professor Matt. This is the Too Many Guys Soccer Show. Like, comment, subscribe, do the thing, and I'll see you on the other side. Take care, my homies.